Paul, originally known as Saul of Tarsus, stands as a pivotal historical figure whose early actions as a persecutor of the nascent Jesus movement reveal the complexities of religious fervor and authority in first-century Judaism. As a devout Pharisee trained under the teacher Gamaliel, Paul embodied the elite religious class dedicated to upholding Jewish law and tradition. His background in Tarsus, combined with Roman citizenship, afforded him a unique position of influence and protection, allowing him to navigate both Jewish and Roman worlds with relative impunity. Before his conversion, Paul viewed the followers of Jesus, referred to as the Way, as a profound threat to Jewish monotheism and the Torah, particularly their proclamation of a crucified man as the Messiah. This perception fueled a campaign of suppression that defined his pre-conversion identity, marking him as a zealous defender of orthodoxy who acted with conviction rather than for personal gain. The historical accounts portray him as a man whose zeal propelled him to extreme measures, setting the stage for a dramatic shift that would redefine his life and the movement he once sought to eradicate. The New Testament frames this transformation as initiated by a divine intervention, a blinding light and voice from the risen Jesus, while psychological analysis explores realistic human factors behind the change. Paul did not derive any financial benefit from his persecution of the early followers of Jesus. Historical records provide no evidence that he received payment, salary, or compensation for these actions. Instead, the texts depict his persecution as driven by intense religious zeal as a Pharisee, not as a compensated role or profession. Before his conversion, Paul was a devout Pharisee trained under Gamaliel, a respected Jewish teacher, and he viewed the early Christian movement, known as the Way, as a dangerous heresy threatening Jewish monotheism and law, particularly because it proclaimed a crucified man as the Messiah. Paul himself states that he persecuted the church beyond measure, and attempted to destroy it out of extreme zeal for his ancestral traditions. The accounts describe him approving the stoning of Stephen, ravaging the church by entering homes and dragging men and women to prison, and pursuing believers to foreign cities like Damascus with letters of authority from the high priest and Sanhedrin. He forced some to blaspheme and voted for executions, but nothing suggests this was compensated work. It was voluntary, ideologically motivated enforcement of Jewish orthodoxy, authorized by religious leaders in Jerusalem. Paul's actual source of income was his trade as a tent maker or leather worker, which he continued even after becoming an apostle. He worked with his hands to support himself during missionary travels, explicitly refusing payment from churches he founded to avoid any appearance of preaching for money. Before conversion, as a Pharisee from a well-connected family with Roman citizenship, he likely had family resources or his trade to sustain himself. There is no biblical indication that persecuting Christians was a paid position, unlike Roman officials or temple guards who might have received stipends. His actions stemmed from personal conviction and zeal, not financial incentive. After his conversion, he expressed deep regret for this period, calling himself the least of the apostles, because he persecuted the church. This absence of financial motivation highlights the purely ideological basis of his persecution, where religious conviction alone drove the intensity of his efforts, free from external incentives or material rewards. The voluntary aspect emphasizes how deeply embedded his zeal was in his identity, transforming persecution into a personal crusade rather than a professional duty. The New Testament's account of his conversion introduces the possibility of purely divine action, with a blinding light and voice from Jesus marking a supernatural intervention that reframed his zealous persecution as opposition to God himself. Paul was a Jew who persecuted other Jews who believed in Jesus. The early followers of Jesus were almost exclusively Jewish. They were Messianic Jews who saw Jesus as the promised Messiah fulfilling Jewish scriptures. Paul targeted these Messianic Jews specifically because he believed their claims, especially that a crucified man was the Messiah, were blasphemous and threatened true Judaism. He describes himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews and zealous Pharisee who persecuted the Church of God. The persecution began in Jerusalem against Jewish believers and expanded to Damascus. These were not Gentiles or outsiders. He went after fellow Jews who had accepted Jesus as Messiah, dragging them to prison and voting for their deaths. His mission was to stamp out what he saw as a dangerous sect within Judaism, not to target non-Jews. Only after his conversion did he become the apostle to the Gentiles. From the New Testament's own portrayal, Paul before conversion appears as a religious zealot engaging in aggressive, violent persecution of early Jewish believers in Jesus, justified through his convictions as a Pharisee. The texts describe him acting with intense religious superiority and self-righteous certainty that he was defending God's law and the purity of Judaism. Paul repeatedly describes his pre-conversion actions as driven by extreme zeal for his ancestral traditions and the Jewish law. In Galatians, he says he persecuted the church violently and tried to destroy it, advancing in Judaism beyond contemporaries through extreme zeal. In Philippians, he lists his credentials as a Pharisee and persecutor of the church, blameless in righteousness under the law. In Acts, he explains he was educated under Gamaliel, strictly observant, and thought he had to do many things hostile to Jesus' name, including imprisoning believers, voting for deaths, and forcing blasphemies, all out of zeal for God. This zeal is presented as religious fanaticism. Paul saw the Messianic Jews as a blasphemous threat to true Judaism because they proclaimed a crucified man as God's anointed one, which he viewed as incompatible with the Torah and monotheism. He believed he was doing God's work by stamping out this heresy, similar to biblical figures like Phinehas or Elijah who used violence to defend the faith against perceived idolatry or false teaching. There is no indication in the texts that he enjoyed the violence for its own sake or was a bully in a personal, sadistic sense. He frames it as dutiful enforcement of religious purity, motivated by conviction that he was advancing in Judaism and protecting the law. And crucially, he was not paid or compensated for it. There is zero mention of any financial reward, salary, bounty, or incentive. It was not a job or profession. Paul was a tent maker and leather worker by trade, and he continued working that trade even as an apostle to support himself voluntarily. His persecution was voluntary, self-motivated religious action, authorized by the high priest and Sanhedrin via letters giving him power to arrest believers in synagogues outside Judea. He did it because he genuinely believed it was righteous and necessary to defend Judaism. No financial motivation is stated or implied. After his conversion, Paul repeatedly expresses deep regret and shame over this period, calling himself unworthy because he persecuted the church and a former blasphemer, persecutor, and insolent opponent. The texts frame his pre-conversion behavior as misguided religious zeal that he later saw as sinful, not as something he took pleasure in or profited from. In summary, Paul was a religiously motivated persecutor who justified his violent actions through his sense of religious superiority and zeal for the law. He targeted fellow Jews who believed in Jesus because he saw their faith as a threat to Judaism. He did it for free, purely out of conviction, not for money or personal enjoyment, and the New Testament portrays it as fanaticism he later renounced. The divine intervention described in the conversion narrative, with its blinding light and voice from Jesus, offers a supernatural explanation for his turnaround, contrasting with psychological interpretations. The New Testament portrayal of pre-conversion Paul paints him as an aggressive, self-righteous religious enforcer who used his authority, social standing, and likely physical intimidation to persecute early believers in Jesus. He was not a lone random bully. He operated with official backing from the Jerusalem religious leadership, which gave him legal religious power to act violently against fellow Jews who followed the way. Paul was a Pharisee, highly respected and educated religious elite, trained under Gamaliel, a top Pharisee teacher, and a Roman citizen, which gave him extra legal protections and status. Authorized by the high priest and Sanhedrin to carry letters granting him power to arrest believers in synagogues outside Judea. With this authorization, he could enter homes and drag people to prison, approve executions by casting his vote, and travel to foreign cities to arrest people in synagogues. He almost certainly had physical backup, either temple guards, synagogue enforcers, or other zealous Jews who shared his views. The texts describe him ravaging the church, forcing people to blaspheme, and pursuing them aggressively. As a young, zealous man with official sanction and likely armed escorts or accomplices, he had the means to intimidate, arrest, and hand people over for punishment. It was institutional power and a gang of like-minded religious enforcers who supported and assisted him. This was a fair characterization of early persecution. The Jerusalem leadership saw the Jesus movement as a dangerous sect within Judaism that needed to be stamped out to protect the law and temple system. Paul and others acted as religious police, using synagogue authority to arrest believers, beat them through floggings common in synagogue punishments, and hand them over for trial or execution. It was organized religious suppression of a rival Jewish group. Paul was part of this gang of zealous Jews who believed they were defending God's honor. There is no indication it was a paid job or full-time occupation. Paul was a tent maker by trade, which he continued later as an apostle to support himself. Persecuting the way was driven by personal religious conviction and zeal, not employment. He did it because he genuinely believed it was righteous and necessary, not for money or as a profession. It was ideological activism, not a salary position. The New Testament presents Paul's conversion as a genuine encounter with the risen Jesus on the Damascus Road. He describes it as a sudden, overwhelming revelation that flipped his worldview. He went from seeing Jesus as a false Messiah to seeing him as the risen Lord. After this, he expresses profound regret, calling himself unworthy because of his past persecution. Possible human factors include exhaustion or conflict from the violence he inflicted, the movement growing despite persecution, a traumatic experience triggering crisis, fear of divine judgment from his Pharisee beliefs, or opportunistic realization that the movement was gaining traction and he could rise to prominence. The narrative frames it as authentic repentance. The former persecutor becomes the persecuted, risking his life to preach what he once tried to destroy. The divine intervention in the vision, with blinding light and Jesus' message, serves as the text's explanation for the shift, balancing psychological interpretations. The scenario of shifting from persecuting a group to joining and advocating for them can be analyzed through psychological and behavioral lenses focusing on realistic mechanisms of change. This transformation involves internal conflict, environmental pressures, or cognitive reevaluation leading to a profound shift in identity, attitudes, and behavior. One core mechanism is cognitive dissonance, mental discomfort when actions, beliefs, or attitudes conflict with new information or self-perception. For a persecutor, witnessing resilience or facing consequences creates dissonance, leading to rationalization of reversal and adoption of the opposing viewpoint to reduce tension. In behavioral terms, this leads to attitude reversal or belief conversion, where the persecutor reevaluates superiority and aligns with the opposed group through self-justification or identity reconstruction. In relational psychology, the drama triangle describes cycling through persecutor, victim, and rescuer roles. A persecutor might switch to victim if confronted with backlash or empathy, then to rescuer or ally by identifying with the group. This shift is driven by underlying fears and results in redemptive transformation, where the former persecutor becomes an advocate to repair harm through reparative behavior, remorse leading to joining the group to atone or seek belonging. Moral injury occurs when someone violates their own moral code through harmful actions, leading to guilt, shame, or existential crisis. For a persecutor, repeated abuse accumulates into moral injury, prompting a change of heart through remorse-driven realignment. This manifests as identity shift or defection, rejecting the former in-group and joining the out-group to resolve conflict. Behaviorally, this is explained by social identity theory, where group membership changes due to perceived benefits or threats. The transformation often involves prosocial compensation, where the former abuser overcorrects by becoming an extreme advocate to make amends. In cognitive behavioral terms, a sudden course correction is called an epiphany or insight experience, where accumulated dissonance or a triggering event leads to rapid reevaluation. This aligns with conversion experiences described as radical behavioral reversal, shifting from antisocial aggression to prosocial affiliation. For a sadistic personality, this could stem from empathy development or self-preservation. Behaviorally, it is modeled as operant conditioning. Negative reinforcements discourage persecution, positive reinforcements encourage the switch. In victimology and restorative justice, reformed perpetrator describes someone moving from abuser to ally through acknowledgement of harm and active reparations. This involves moral conversion, internalizing the persecuted group's perspective, leading to group defection and advocacy. Psychologically, this can be linked to narcissistic injury resolution or fear-based realignment. The outcome is often overcompensation, where the former persecutor becomes a fervent supporter to redeem their past self-image. These terms collectively explain a realistic shift from persecution to alliance as a multifaceted process involving cognitive, emotional, and social factors, often triggered by crisis or reflection. The New Testament's divine intervention account, with blinding light and Jesus' voice, offers an alternative explanation, while opportunistic realization of the movement's growth integrates with psychological factors like self-preservation. Paul's pre-conversion behavior aligns with characteristics of an abusive personality leveraging authority to exert control over others. As Saul, he operated with sanction from the Jewish religious leadership, enabling him to arrest, imprison, and vote for the execution of fellow Jews who believed in Jesus as Messiah, without facing personal repercussions. This impunity stemmed from his status as a Pharisee and Roman citizen, granting him institutional power to enforce orthodoxy through violence and intimidation. The texts describe him ravaging homes, dragging people to prison, and pursuing believers to foreign cities, actions that reflect a pattern of abuse justified by religious conviction rather than legal accountability. In psychological terms, this represents authoritarian aggression, where an individual uses hierarchical power to suppress perceived threats, often deriving a sense of superiority or validation from the dominance. The shift from persecutor to advocate could stem from a pragmatic decision to repurpose his aggressive traits for personal advantage within the emerging movement. Charismatic individuals with abusive histories often rechannel their dominance into new arenas, such as leadership roles that offer social influence and moral authority. Paul's post-conversion career as an apostle involved assertive preaching, theological debates, and establishing churches, where his gregarious nature and rhetorical skills allowed him to gain prominence. Behaviorally, this resembles instrumental aggression redirection, where physical or direct hostility transforms into indirect forms like verbal persuasion or doctrinal control, disguised as benevolent guidance. The change might have provided him with a platform to exert influence over a growing group, turning former opposition into a vehicle for self-elevation. Parallels exist with patterns where young, aggressive males mature into manipulative leaders through religious or cult-like structures. Such individuals often exhibit antisocial traits in youth, then transition to narcissistic leadership in adulthood, using charisma to build followings while maintaining control through psychological means like moral superiority or group conformity pressure. Paul's transformation fits this archetype, from physically abusive enforcer to a figure who verbally dominates debates and reshapes the movement's theology. By joining and then leading aspects of the way, he effectively assumed authority over the group he once persecuted, potentially abusing that position by imposing his vision, universal faith emphasizing his revelation, over the original Jewish messianic focus. This could represent a subconscious strategy for self-mastery, where conquering the enemy religion by becoming its chief interpreter satisfies a need for control, reframing past abuses as redemptive zeal. The divine intervention in the vision, with its blinding light and message from Jesus, provides the New Testament's explanation for the shift, balancing opportunistic interpretations with supernatural action. Conclusion: the complex legacy of Paul's transformation and its impact on early Christianity. Paul's pre-conversion life as a persecutor reveals a pattern of religiously motivated abuse that relied on institutional authority and personal conviction rather than financial gain. His actions, imprisoning believers, approving executions, and pursuing them across regions, were voluntary expressions of zeal for Jewish orthodoxy, authorized by the high priest and Sanhedrin, and driven by a belief that the Jesus movement threatened the integrity of Judaism. The absence of any monetary incentive highlights the ideological purity of his campaign, where religious superiority justified violence without external rewards. This voluntary nature underscores how fanaticism can sustain prolonged harm, with Paul's Pharisee status and Roman citizenship providing protection from consequences while amplifying his capacity to intimidate and control. The New Testament's candid portrayal of this period serves as a historical record of how zealotry can manifest as organized oppression within religious communities, targeting fellow believers in a shared faith tradition. The possibility that opportunistic realization of the movement's growth influenced his later shift adds a pragmatic dimension to his legacy, suggesting self-interest may have interwoven with ideological conviction. The psychological dimensions of Paul's shift from persecutor to apostle illuminate a process where internal conflict and moral reevaluation lead to radical realignment. Cognitive dissonance, moral injury, and fear-based realignment combine to produce a transformation that redirected aggression from suppression to advocacy. The reformed perpetrator's overcompensation is evident in his fervent leadership, where charisma and rhetorical skill enabled him to dominate the movement he once opposed. Parallels to modern patterns of abusive individuals transitioning to manipulative religious authority highlight the enduring human capacity to reframe harm as redemptive mission. Paul's case illustrates how personal crisis can channel destructive traits into influential leadership, reshaping a group's identity through doctrinal imposition. The inclusion of opportunistic motives, such as recognizing the movement's traction as a path to prominence, integrates with these mechanisms, indicating that self-elevation and control may have played roles alongside remorse or fear. The divine intervention in the vision, with blinding light and Jesus' voice, offers the New Testament's supernatural explanation, balancing psychological interpretations with the possibility of purely divine action. Paul's legacy as both persecutor and architect of Christianity reflects the complex origins of the faith. His voluntary persecution demonstrates the dangers of unchecked religious superiority, while his conversion shows the potential for redirection through internal crisis. The New Testament's preservation of this duality, abuser turned apostle, underscores the faith's roots in conflict and transformation. Paul's shift from physical enforcement to theological dominance ensured his vision of universal salvation through faith became central, influencing the movement's trajectory. This transformation, viewed through psychological and behavioral lenses, reveals a pattern where aggression evolves into authority, leaving a lasting imprint on the religion he helped define. The story of Paul remains a profound example of how personal conviction, institutional power, and psychological change can converge to reshape religious identity and legacy, with opportunistic elements adding layers to the motivations behind his profound realignment. The divine action described in the blinding light and message from Jesus provides the historical account's explanation for this change, integrating supernatural intervention as a key possibility in understanding his path.